Predive stress is a constantly misunderstood element in technical scuba diving. It's a factor that I see affect dives on a pretty regular basis. Today I want to talk about how we prevent it, how we recognize it, and how we deal with it when it does occur. I also want to give you one quick rule of thumb that any scuba diver should use: pre-dive. Hello and welcome to Scuba with Steve. I'm Steve, and this is a place where we talk about things you might not have learned on a course. It's where I share my experience and hopefully spread some education, hopefully making us all safer and better divers. For us as scuba divers, we can break down stress into one of three types. Either it's going to be pre-dive, on the dive, or post-dive. The thing about stress is it can quickly, silently, and dangerously follow you from one phase to the other phase. So if you don't prevent the stress from happening, we need to be able to identify it so we can deal with it. As a technical dive guide and instructor, I'm led to believe, mostly through my own experience, that a vast majority of students do not spend enough time identifying or dealing with pre-dive stress correctly. Most recreational and technical scuba divers cover the basics pretty well. By basics, I mean things like making sure that this dive is within your training and certification level, making sure that you do a good pre-dive check, as laid out in detail in one of my other videos, making sure that you're physically fit enough to do the dive you want to do, not drinking alcohol before the dive, not diving on zero sleep. If you have a bad night, just don't go diving the next day. Making sure environmental conditions are suitable for you. These are all things that most divers do a decent job of, but there's a couple of sneaky things that happen that can increase diver stress pre-dive, and a lot of divers don't catch them. These sneaky things that increase divers' stress are things like forgetting some piece of equipment back at the dive shop, or leaving a piece of equipment on the boat or at the truck whenever you're already in the water, or even having some piece of equipment break either while setting up your equipment or while doing your safety checks. From my experience, I can tell you, when your average scuba diver has one of these sneaky things happen, they're gonna make a mistake on the dive. So when these things happen, it's crazy important that we take the time to recognize and respect that something stressful has happened within the team. My best example to use is this one time I was diving with a repeat client, someone who I dive with pretty regularly, once or twice a year for at least 2 weeks at a time. We were diving this one time at a cenote called No Hachnacheech, getting ready for a cave dive. When doing the pre-dive checks, I noticed some bubbles coming from the SPG on one of his two tanks. We went over to the side, I pulled out my tearing tool, tried to fix it as best I could. In the water, wasn't happening. The O-rings were too far gone. So both of us took our tanks completely off. We got his tank and regulator out of the water, went up the stairs, across to the parking lot, to the back of the truck, replaced everything, lubed everything up nice and good, got it back in the water, no problems. For me, as a dive guide, this was not a big deal, but then I asked him, have you ever had an equipment failure before a dive? Or have you ever had a reason where at the last moment you had to get out of the water to then get back in? He said no, this was his first time. So I took the time there to go over my normal spiel about how we're gonna try to make sure that this incident doesn't lead to more pre-dive stress, which will follow us into the cave. I reiterated multiple times that we have 4 hours before the cenote closes, and we're only going to go do like a 2-hour dive. We have plenty of time. So let's really slow down. Let's go down to the water together, get our tanks on together, do our pre-dive checks, and just start the whole thing over nice and slowly. As we're doing the pre-dive checks, I noticed my client is rushing through things. I try to slow him down. He rushes some more. I'm like, hey man, we talked about how we're gonna slow down and not let any stress follow us into the dive, right? Yeah, okay. We descended as a team together and started making our way towards the primary tie-off with me being in the front. I notice that his light, which is shining in front of me because he's behind me, is wiggling kind of awkwardly. I stop, I turn around, and I look at him and I see he's opening one of his two tanks. The dive has already started. Making sure all of your tanks are open is literally the second thing we check in all of our pre-dive checks. And by the way that we do all of our pre-dive checks, you should definitely notice if one is closed by the end. Because he decided to rush through the pre-dive checks and not do everything as slowly and calmly as he could, he ended up making a mistake that really like an open water side mount diver should make. Not someone who's about to go do a cave dive. I looked at him, I thumbed the dive, we went up to the surface and we talked. And I said, friend, did you just reopen one of your tanks because it was closed through the whole pre-dive check? He said, yeah, I was just gonna open it right now real quick. I said, admittedly, a little louder than I should have. We don't go into caves like that! We talked about it before the dive. We're gonna go slow, we're gonna slow down, we're not gonna let this stress carry us into the dive, we're not gonna rush things. We had all the time in the world. What you just did was try to go into an overhead environment with only one tank. That is some very unsafe behavior. It's not something that's at all like you to do because I've done many days of scuba diving with you. I can tell that for today, your head is not in it and you're not ready mentally to do this dive. So I, being the dive guide, had the very uncomfortable position or had the very uncomfortable responsibility to call the dive. My job is to keep you safe, and right now, you are not diving safely. We went back, called it a day, got some food, got some sleep, reset, and then the next day, he dived fine for the rest of his trip here. I've done many dives with him already. I'll continue to do more dives with him every time he comes down for a trip. But in this situation, as the more experienced cave diver, it was my responsibility to help educate the less experienced cave diver. Like, right now, this is an example of stress, and we don't want to carry that in the cave. How do we stop pre-dive stress from getting into the dive? Well, the safest option is always just going to be to call the dive. As technical divers, when we experience problems underwater, their consequences can be pretty severe, very quickly, and more importantly, very silently. So how can we identify and measure pre-dive stress, and is this too much stress for me? It's very difficult to do. So there's kind of a rough rule of thumb that technical divers like to use, and we call it the 3-strike rule. If I'm doing a dive and 3 things go wrong before the dive, I go ahead and call it. It's a pretty popular rule among tech divers, the mentality being, I'm an experienced diver, I shouldn't be making these kinds of mistakes. And if I leave something at the dive site, or if 3 of my O-rings all explode on the same day, maybe today's just not the day. If I leave my fins behind at the dive shop, then we drive back and get them, and then we get to the dive shop, and oh, I forgot something else in the truck. I go back to the truck, I get into the water, and then in the water I have 2 equipment problems. You know what? Steve probably shouldn't be diving today, right? Once you get to 3 strikes, you just call it. I've added my own little step to this rule, which is the 5-minute break. Anytime one of these things causes us as a team to get out of the water and then get back in, take our tanks off if we're side mount diving or twin setting, we get all the way back up and out. If we have to get out of the water to then get back in, once we're all back in and ready to go, before we do our pre-dive checks, 5-minute break. We take these 5 minutes to just rest, relax, make sure our heart rates aren't still elevated, make sure mentally we're not trying to rush and make up for lost time and get back in the water real fast. And then I'll take an extra couple minutes here to talk about pre-dive stress and be like, hey man, is this the first time you've experienced something pre-dive go wrong? Oh yeah, it is. So we talk about pre-dive stress and how we're gonna approach this dive in a calm, collective manner. The important thing to realize is that pre-dive stress, when left unchecked, can quickly, easily, and silently follow you from the pre-dive into the dive. Take the time to recognize, reduce, and respect pre-dive stress, and never ever be afraid to call or turn a dive. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, go do something cool and be safe.